The Utah desert stretched endlessly before them, its red sandstone formations catching the morning light like ancient monuments to a forgotten civilization. While Sarah and Michael Chen stood at the edge of their greatest adventure together, unaware that they were also standing at the threshold of their final day on Earth. Sarah's 7-month pregnancy had not diminished her enthusiasm for exploration, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly, as she gazed across the vast expanse of rock and sky that had drawn them away from their comfortable life in Salt Lake City for what they had planned as their last camping trip before becoming parents. The desert air carried the scent of sage and sun-baked stone, a purity that seemed to promise renewal and discovery to a couple who had spent months preparing for this moment of solitude and connection with the natural world. Michael's excitement was infectious as he adjusted the straps of his well-worn hiking pack, his eyes scanning the geological formations that had fascinated him since childhood visits to Utah's national parks with his grandfather. As a software engineer who spent most of his days immersed in digital landscapes, he craved the tactile reality of rock and sand, the challenge of navigating terrain that couldn't be mapped by GPS or understood through computer algorithms. His weathered hiking boots and sun-faded outdoor gear told the story of countless weekends spent exploring the wilderness areas of the American West. But this trip was different, carrying the weight of transition and the bittersweet knowledge that such adventures would become rare once their child was born. Sarah's journal, carefully tucked into her day pack alongside bottles of water and pregnancy-safe snacks, contained weeks of research about their destination in the remote wilderness near Moab, where ancient Navajo stories spoke of places where the earth opened to reveal secrets that were not meant for human eyes. As a freelance photographer specializing in landscape and nature work, she had been drawn to this area by reports of unusual rock formations that created natural arches and chambers, geological phenomena that had been carved by millions of years of wind and water into shapes that seemed almost architectural in their precision. Her camera equipment, protected in waterproof cases, represented thousands of dollars of investment in capturing images that might never be seen by anyone except Michael and their unborn child. The forecast for their 3-day camping expedition had been perfect when they left Salt Lake City on the morning of September 15, 2010. With clear skies and moderate temperatures that would allow comfortable hiking during the day and pleasant evenings around their campfire. Sarah's obstetrician had cleared her for the trip, with the understanding that they would avoid strenuous hiking and stay within range of cellular communication, precautions that seemed reasonable given Michael's extensive experience with desert camping and their careful preparation for every conceivable emergency. Their families had been supportive but cautious, recognizing that this expedition represented an important milestone in the couple's relationship, while worrying about the wisdom of venturing into remote wilderness with a pregnancy so far advanced. The drive from Salt Lake City to their chosen campsite near the San Rafael Swell had taken them through increasingly desolate terrain, past small towns that seemed to exist primarily to service the occasional adventurer seeking access to Utah's hidden geological treasures. Michael's truck, loaded with camping equipment, emergency supplies, and enough food and water for a week in the desert, represented the culmination of months of planning and preparation for what they had envisioned as a spiritual retreat before the responsibilities of parenthood changed their lives forever. Sarah had documented their journey with photographs that captured her growing excitement as familiar landscapes gave way to the alien beauty of deep desert. Images that would later become heartbreaking evidence of a couple's joy in the final hours of their life together. Their campsite, carefully selected from topographic maps and online forums dedicated to Utah's backcountry exploration, was situated in a natural amphitheater of red rock that provided shelter from wind while offering spectacular views of geological formations that had been shaped by forces operating on timescales incomprehensible to human experience. The location was remote enough to guarantee solitude, but accessible by truck over roads that, while rough, had been traveled by countless other adventurers seeking the kind of wilderness experience that was becoming increasingly rare in an urbanized world. Michael's GPS unit showed their coordinates as precisely plotted waypoints that he had marked during months of planning, but the device could not capture the emotional significance of a place where two people hoped to find peace and connection before their world changed forever. The first day of their expedition unfolded exactly as they had hoped, with Michael leading gentle hikes to nearby rock formations, while Sarah documented their discoveries with photographs that showed both the grandeur of the landscape and the intimate moments of a couple sharing adventure in a place that seemed designed by nature for contemplation and renewal. Their conversations, recorded in Sarah's journal during rest breaks and evening reflection time, revealed their excitement about impending parenthood mixed with the kind of philosophical discussions that arise naturally when people find themselves surrounded by geological evidence of the Earth's vast age and indifference to human concerns. Evening brought the spectacular sunset that had been one of their primary motivations for choosing this remote location. The red rocks blazing with colors that Sarah's camera could only approximate, while Michael prepared a simple meal over their portable camp stove. Their satellite phone, brought as a safety precaution, showed full signal strength and battery power, reassuring them that help was available if needed, while they enjoyed the profound silence that can only be found in places where human activity has not yet overwhelmed the natural soundscape. The stars that emerged as darkness fell were so brilliant in the absence of light pollution that both Sarah and Michael felt overwhelmed by the cosmic perspective that such displays inevitably provide, a humbling reminder of their place in a universe far larger and more mysterious than their daily concerns usually acknowledged. The last contact with civilization came at 8:43 p.m. Mountain Time on September 16th, when Sarah called her mother from their campsite to report that they were safe and enjoying perfect weather, their voices carrying the relaxed happiness of people who had found exactly what they were looking for in their wilderness retreat. Her mother would later remember that Sarah sounded completely normal, excited about the photographs she was taking, and looking forward to one more day of exploration before beginning their drive home to Salt Lake City. The conversation lasted 17 minutes and ended with Sarah's promise to call again the following evening, a commitment that would never be fulfilled, because sometime during the night that followed, Sarah and Michael Chen would vanish from the Utah desert, as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions that would haunt their families for a decade and challenge every assumption about what was possible in a landscape that had already claimed too many lives to count. The morning of September 17, 2010, arrived with an unnatural stillness that seemed to press against the red rock walls of the canyon where Sarah and Michael Chen had made their final camp, the absence of their usual dawn activity creating a silence that would soon alert the desert's few other inhabitants that something had gone fundamentally wrong in this remote corner of Utah's wilderness. Their tent remained perfectly intact, its zippers closed and rain fly properly secured, giving no indication of hasty departure or struggle, while their camping equipment lay arranged with the methodical organization that characterized Michael's approach to outdoor adventures. The morning coffee that Sarah had planned to brew over their camp stove remained unmade, the water bottles and instant coffee packets sitting exactly where she had placed them the previous evening, as if time had somehow stopped during the night hours when the couple should have been sleeping peacefully under the brilliant desert stars. The first sign that the Chen's absence was more than a simple change of plans came when Sarah's mother, Linda Walsh, received no response to her text messages sent throughout the morning, followed by calls that went directly to voicemail, despite the satellite phone's previously reliable signal strength. Linda's growing concern was initially dismissed by her husband as the natural worry of a mother whose pregnant daughter was camping in a remote location. But as the day wore on without any communication from a couple who had promised to check in regularly, her anxiety began to infect the entire extended family network that had been following the trip through social media updates and promised phone calls. By 6 p.m. on September 17th, when Sarah and Michael should have been breaking camp for their return journey to Salt Lake City, their continued silence had transformed from mere concern into active alarm among family members who knew that both Sarah and Michael were conscientious about maintaining contact, especially given Sarah's pregnancy and the remote nature of their camping location. Michael's brother David attempted to contact park rangers and local sheriff's departments, but the bureaucratic confusion about which agency had jurisdiction over the specific area where the couple was camping delayed the initiation of formal search procedures until precious hours had been lost to administrative inefficiency and the assumption that most missing hikers would eventually emerge from the wilderness on their own. The official search began at dawn on September 18th, with teams from the Emery County Sheriff's Office and volunteer search and rescue organizations converging on the coordinates that Michael had provided to his family before departing for their camping trip. The searchers found the couple's campsite exactly as described in their communications, with every piece of equipment accounted for except the personal items that Sarah and Michael would logically have carried with them on a short hike: their day packs, water bottles, camera equipment, and the satellite phone that had been their lifeline to the outside world. The absence of their hiking boots from the tent while their other shoes remained neatly arranged suggested that they had left voluntarily, but the lack of any note or indication of their intended destination created an immediate puzzle for investigators who were accustomed to missing person cases that offered at least some clue about the victim's final movements. The search area expanded rapidly as teams realized that the terrain around the Chen's campsite offered numerous possibilities for exploration, from slot canyons that could trap unwary hikers to overlooks that provided spectacular views but required careful navigation across exposed rock faces. Tracking dogs brought from Salt Lake City found scent trails that led in multiple directions from the campsite, but none of the trails continued long enough to indicate a clear path that the couple might have followed, as if their scent had simply dissipated into the dry desert air without reaching any logical destination. The search helicopters that crisscrossed the area throughout the day found no sign of bright clothing or equipment that should have been visible from above, despite perfect weather conditions and visibility that extended for miles across the open terrain. Search teams discovered the first tangible evidence of the couple's fate approximately 2 kilometers from their campsite, where Sarah's distinctive red water bottle and Michael's GPS unit were found lying separately in a small wash that showed signs of recent water flow despite the lack of precipitation in the area for several weeks. The items appeared to have been placed rather than dropped, arranged in a way that suggested deliberate positioning rather than accidental loss during a struggle or fall. More disturbing was the condition of the GPS unit, which had been damaged in a manner that seemed inconsistent with impact against rocks or exposure to weather. Its screen cracked and internal components scattered, as if someone had deliberately destroyed the device to prevent it from revealing location data that might explain the couple's disappearance. The discovery of these items raised more questions than it answered, particularly when forensic examination revealed that both objects had been exposed to some kind of chemical that had altered their surfaces in ways that were inconsistent with normal environmental exposure in the Utah desert. The water bottle showed signs of having been subjected to extreme heat that had partially melted its plastic construction, while the GPS unit contained traces of an acidic substance that had corroded its metal components in patterns that suggested intentional destruction rather than accidental damage. These findings introduced the possibility that the couple's disappearance involved human intervention rather than natural causes, transforming what had initially been treated as a wilderness rescue operation into a potential criminal investigation. As the search entered its 4th day without any additional discoveries, the mood among rescue workers shifted from optimism to grim determination, with experienced personnel acknowledging privately that the chances of finding Sarah and Michael alive had diminished to virtually zero given the desert's unforgiving environment and the couple's limited supplies. The expanded search area now covered more than 50 square miles of some of Utah's most challenging terrain, including areas that were considered dangerous even for experienced hikers. But no additional evidence emerged to explain how 2 people could simply vanish from a landscape that offered few places for concealment, and fewer still that could account for the complete absence of any trail or indication of their final movements. The media attention that began to focus on the case brought unwanted scrutiny to a search operation that was already struggling with limited resources and the vast scale of the terrain that needed to be covered, while also generating thousands of tips and theories from well-meaning members of the public who had no actual knowledge of the case but were convinced they could provide insights that professional searchers had missed. Among these amateur theories were suggestions that the couple had been abducted by human traffickers, attacked by wild animals, or fallen victim to one of the many hidden dangers that made Utah's backcountry notorious among experienced outdoor enthusiasts who understood that even minor mistakes could have fatal consequences in an environment where rescue might be days away even under ideal circumstances. The investigation that would consume the next decade had begun with the discovery of two everyday objects in a desert wash. But the questions they raised about the fate of Sarah and Michael Chen would prove far more complex and disturbing than anyone involved in the initial search could have imagined, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to discoveries that challenged every assumption about what was possible in the seemingly empty wilderness of Utah's Red Rock Country. The official investigation into the disappearance of Sarah and Michael Chen took on a more systematic approach as Detective Maria Santos from the Utah State Bureau of Investigation arrived at the search command post with a team of forensic specialists and criminal investigators whose expertise extended far beyond typical missing person cases. Santos had built her reputation handling complex disappearances in Utah's wilderness areas, cases that often involved elements of foul play disguised as hiking accidents or natural disasters, and her initial assessment of the Chen case suggested patterns that were disturbingly familiar to someone who understood how the desert's isolation could be exploited by individuals with knowledge of the terrain and criminal intent. The forensic analysis of the damaged GPS unit and water bottle revealed trace evidence that fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation, with laboratory results indicating the presence of industrial chemicals that had no natural occurrence in the Utah desert environment. The acidic compound found on both items was identified as a mixture commonly used in mining operations for extracting precious metals from ore, a discovery that led investigators to examine historical records of mining activity in the area surrounding the Chen's campsite. These records revealed a network of abandoned mines and prospect holes that had been excavated during the uranium boom of the 1950s, underground workings that had been sealed or abandoned when ore prices collapsed, but which remained largely unmapped and potentially accessible to anyone with knowledge of their locations. The search teams were redirected to focus on these historical mining sites, many of which were hidden by decades of erosion and vegetation growth that made them nearly invisible to casual observers but potentially deadly to hikers who might stumble into unmarked shafts or tunnels that could extend hundreds of feet underground. The terrain around each abandoned mine was carefully searched using ground-penetrating radar and specialized cameras that could peer into openings too dangerous for human exploration. But the technical challenges of examining dozens of sites scattered across miles of rough country meant that progress was slow and often inconclusive. Local residents began to share stories that had never been officially reported, tales of strange activities in the desert during recent years that included unusual vehicle traffic in areas that should have been deserted, lights seen moving through the landscape during nighttime hours when legitimate mining or exploration would not occur, and the discovery of equipment and supplies that seemed inconsistent with recreational camping or standard geological survey work. An elderly rancher named Thomas Whitefeather, whose family had grazed cattle in the area for 3 generations, spoke reluctantly about finding disturbed ground near abandoned mine sites, earth that had been recently excavated and then carefully concealed in ways that suggested someone was using the remote locations for activities they wanted to keep hidden from authority. The investigation took a darker turn when Santos discovered that the Chen case was not the first unexplained disappearance in the region. With records revealing at least 6 other incidents over the past 15 years involving solo hikers or small groups who had vanished without trace from areas within a 30-mile radius of where Sarah and Michael had made their final camp. The pattern of these disappearances suggested either an unusual concentration of natural hazards or the presence of human predators who were using the desert's isolation and the mining area's hidden dangers to eliminate victims in ways that would appear accidental to investigators who were not looking for signs of foul play. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to answers came when Santos interviewed Jake Morrison, a former uranium miner who had worked the area during the 1970s and maintained detailed personal records of mine locations and underground tunnel systems that were far more complete than any official surveys. Morrison's hand-drawn maps revealed a vast network of interconnected workings that extended far beyond what government records indicated, underground passages that had been expanded and modified by successive generations of miners seeking ore deposits that had proven largely illusory, but had left behind a maze of tunnels that could conceal almost anything. Morrison's most disturbing revelation was his account of recent encounters with individuals who had been exploring the abandoned mines using equipment and techniques that suggested purposes far removed from historical research or recreational caving. He described seeing vehicles parked near mine entrances during night hours, hearing machinery operating in tunnels that should have been empty, and finding evidence that some underground areas had been modified with concrete reinforcement and electrical systems that were clearly modern installations rather than historical mining infrastructure. His reluctance to report these observations to authorities stemmed from a combination of uncertainty about what he had witnessed and a lifetime of distrust for government agencies that had been responsible for the environmental damage left behind by the uranium industry. The realization that the abandoned mine network might be connected to the Chen disappearance led Santos to organize a specialized underground search operation using experienced cavers and mining engineers who possessed the technical expertise necessary to safely explore tunnel systems that had been abandoned for decades without proper maintenance or safety assessments. The operation required extensive preparation and specialized equipment, but the potential that Sarah and Michael might be found alive in underground spaces that had not yet been searched provided motivation that overcame concerns about the risks involved in exploring unstable underground workings in a remote desert location. As preparations for the underground search intensified, additional evidence emerged that suggested the Chen case might be connected to organized criminal activity that was using Utah's abandoned mining infrastructure for purposes that extended far beyond simple disposal of murder victims. Federal agencies became involved when laboratory analysis of the chemical traces found on the couple's belongings matched substances that had been connected to illegal drug manufacturing operations, while communication intercepts revealed radio traffic in the area that used codes and procedures associated with sophisticated criminal organizations rather than the casual chatter of recreational desert users or legitimate mining operations. The investigation that had begun with a missing couple's camping trip was evolving into something far more complex and dangerous, revealing layers of criminal activity that had been hidden beneath the seemingly empty landscape of Utah's desert wilderness, protected by isolation and the assumption that no one would look too carefully at what happened in places where few people ventured, and even fewer remained long enough to witness whatever secrets the abandoned mines might contain. The underground exploration of the abandoned mine network began with Cave Rescue Team Alpha, led by experienced spelunker Captain Lisa Rodriguez, whose 20 years of emergency response in underground environments had prepared her for the technical challenges of navigating unstable tunnel systems while searching for evidence of human activity in spaces that had been sealed from daylight for decades. The team's specialized equipment included atmospheric monitoring devices to detect dangerous gases, structural assessment tools to evaluate tunnel stability, and communication systems that could maintain contact with surface coordinators even in the deepest sections of the underground maze that Morrison's maps suggested extended for miles beneath the Utah desert. The first mine entrance that Rodriguez's team explored was located approximately 4 miles from the Chen's campsite, hidden behind a rockfall that appeared natural but showed signs of deliberate arrangement to conceal the opening from casual observation. The tunnel beyond the entrance had been modified with concrete reinforcement and electrical conduits that were clearly modern installations, evidence that someone had invested significant resources in upgrading underground spaces for purposes that required reliable power and structural integrity, far beyond what historical uranium extraction would have demanded. The air inside carried odors that were distinctly chemical rather than the musty earthiness typical of abandoned mines, suggesting recent industrial activity in spaces that should have been dormant for decades. Rodriguez's team discovered the first direct evidence of recent human presence when they found a storage area approximately 200 feet underground, where supplies and equipment had been cached in waterproof containers that bore no identifying marks, but contained materials consistent with long-term habitation of underground spaces. The supplies included medical equipment, communication devices, and food stores that would support multiple individuals for extended periods, while the equipment suggested activities that required precision and coordination, rather than the casual exploration that might be expected from recreational cavers or historical researchers interested in mining heritage. The discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation team came when Rodriguez found evidence that some sections of the mine complex had been used as living quarters, with sleeping areas, waste disposal systems, and even rudimentary kitchen facilities that indicated prolonged occupation by individuals who had transformed the underground spaces into a functional habitat. The living areas showed signs of recent use, with personal belongings and clothing that suggested occupancy within the past several months, while the sophistication of the installations indicated access to resources and expertise that exceeded what would be available to casual criminals or transient populations seeking temporary shelter. More disturbing was the discovery of restraint systems and holding areas that had been constructed in the deepest sections of the mine complex, spaces that could only be accessed through narrow passages that would make escape impossible for anyone who was not familiar with the underground layout. These areas contained evidence of human habitation under conditions that were clearly involuntary, with anchoring points for chains and cables, waste disposal systems that indicated prolonged confinement, and soundproofing materials that would prevent any cries for help from reaching the surface or other areas of the mine complex. The breakthrough that confirmed the connection between the underground complex and the Chen disappearance came when Rodriguez's team found personal belongings that matched descriptions provided by the missing couple's families, items that had clearly been removed from their original owners and stored in areas where they would never be found by conventional search methods. Sarah's distinctive hiking pack was discovered in a storage area along with Michael's camping gear, both showing signs of having been searched and processed by individuals who understood the importance of eliminating evidence that could connect the underground complex to specific missing person cases. The recovery of these items was accompanied by the discovery of documentation that revealed the true scope of the criminal operation that had been using Utah's abandoned mine network as a base for activities that extended far beyond simple kidnapping or murder. Handwritten logs and inventory sheets found in waterproof containers documented the processing of multiple individuals over a period of several years, with coded references that suggested an organized human trafficking operation that was using the remote desert location and underground facilities to hold victims before transporting them to other locations where they would be sold or otherwise disposed of. Captain Rodriguez's report to Detective Santos described an underground complex that had been systematically developed as a criminal enterprise, with multiple levels of tunnels that served different functions in what appeared to be a sophisticated operation for kidnapping, holding, and processing human victims. The technical expertise required to create such facilities suggested involvement by individuals with engineering or mining backgrounds, while the scope of the operation indicated financial resources and organizational capabilities that exceeded what local law enforcement agencies were equipped to handle without federal assistance. The evidence collected from the underground complex painted a horrifying picture of what had likely happened to Sarah and Michael Chen during their final night in the Utah desert, suggesting that they had been targeted by individuals who specialized in making people disappear in ways that would never be connected to organized criminal activity. The couple's remote camping location and their isolation from other travelers had made them ideal victims for predators who understood that the desert's vastness and the presence of natural hazards would provide plausible explanations for disappearances that were actually the result of deliberate criminal action. As the investigation expanded to include federal agencies with jurisdiction over organized crime and human trafficking, the underground complex beneath the Utah desert was revealed to be just one component of a network that extended across multiple states, using remote locations and natural features to conceal activities that had been claiming victims for years, while remaining completely invisible to law enforcement agencies that were focused on more conventional forms of criminal activity. The Chen case had exposed a criminal enterprise that challenged every assumption about what was possible in America's remote wilderness areas, revealing that even the most isolated locations could be exploited by predators who understood how to use geography and official indifference to hide crimes that would shock the conscience of anyone who discovered their true scope and sophistication. The federal investigation that followed the discovery of the underground complex transformed what had been a missing persons case into one of the largest human trafficking prosecutions in Utah's history, with FBI Special Agent Patricia Winters leading a multi-agency task force that would eventually uncover evidence of criminal activities spanning more than a decade and involving victims from across the western United States. The sophisticated nature of the operation revealed through Rodriguez's underground exploration suggested coordination between multiple criminal organizations that had exploited the isolation of Utah's desert wilderness and the presence of abandoned mining infrastructure to create what amounted to a hidden processing center for human cargo destined for illegal markets throughout North America. The forensic analysis of materials recovered from the mine complex provided investigators with their first clear timeline of events during Sarah and Michael Chen's final hours, with evidence suggesting that the couple had been abducted from their campsite during the early morning hours of September 17th by individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of their location and daily routines. Soil samples from the underground holding areas contained DNA evidence that matched both victims, while chemical analysis of restraint devices revealed biological traces that indicated the couple had been held alive in the underground complex for at least several days before being killed, their deaths apparently coinciding with the arrival of transportation that would have moved them to other locations if they had not died first. The revelation that Sarah and Michael had survived their initial abduction only to die while being held captive in the underground facility added a layer of tragedy to their case that devastated their families and shocked investigators who had hoped that the couple's deaths had been quick and relatively painless. Medical examination of biological evidence suggested that Sarah's pregnancy had complicated her captivity, with indications that she had gone into premature labor while being held underground, a medical emergency that her captors had been either unwilling or unable to address properly, resulting in the deaths of both mother and unborn child in circumstances that represented criminal negligence even by the standards of an organization engaged in systematic human trafficking. Agent Winters' investigation revealed that the Chen case was connected to at least 12 other disappearances that had occurred throughout Utah, Arizona, and Nevada over the past 8 years, with victims selected according to criteria that maximized their vulnerability, while minimizing the likelihood that their disappearances would generate intensive law enforcement attention. Solo travelers, couples without children, and individuals with limited family connections had been systematically targeted by spotters who monitored popular camping and hiking areas, identifying potential victims who could be taken without immediate alarm, being raised by people who would demand aggressive search efforts. The operational structure of the trafficking network was revealed through communications equipment and documentation found in the underground complex, showing a hierarchical organization that included scouts who identified targets, acquisition teams that handled actual kidnappings, holding facility operators who managed victims during transport delays, and disposal specialists who eliminated evidence when victims were no longer useful for trafficking purposes. The sophistication of the operation included corruption of local officials, who ensured that missing person investigations would be hampered by jurisdictional confusion and resource limitations, while legitimate businesses provided cover for transportation and financial transactions that supported the criminal enterprise. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to arrests came when Agent Winters identified Marcus Webb, a former mining engineer who had used his technical expertise to design and construct the underground facilities that served as the network's primary holding and processing center in Utah. Webb's background included legitimate work in mine safety and underground construction, knowledge that had been perverted to create spaces where human beings could be held in conditions that ensured their complete helplessness while remaining undetectable to surface-based search efforts that had been the focus of traditional missing person investigations. Webb's arrest in Las Vegas led to the discovery of additional facilities in Arizona and California, revealing the true scope of a trafficking network that had been operating across multiple states while remaining completely invisible to federal agencies that had been focused on more conventional forms of organized crime. The network's victims included not just random travelers like the Chens, but also individuals who had been specifically targeted for elimination, witnesses to other crimes whose disappearances served the dual purpose of eliminating threats, while generating revenue through trafficking operations that treated human beings as disposable commodities. The interrogation of network members revealed details about Sarah and Michael's final days that were both heartbreaking and infuriating to investigators who understood that the couple's deaths could have been prevented if law enforcement agencies had recognized the patterns that connected multiple disappearances across the region. The couple had apparently been selected for trafficking rather than immediate elimination, but Sarah's pregnancy had made her unsuitable for the markets the network served, while Michael's knowledge of their location and the circumstances of their abduction had made him too dangerous to keep alive once transportation arrangements fell through. The evidence recovered from the underground complex included Sarah's journal, its final entries providing a first-hand account of their abduction and captivity that would serve as crucial testimony in the prosecutions that followed. Her words described the terror of being taken from their campsite by armed men, the horror of being dragged into underground spaces that seemed designed for nightmare scenarios, and her desperate attempts to protect her unborn child while understanding that their captors viewed them as nothing more than inventory to be processed according to market demands that reduced human beings to their most basic commercial value. The investigation that had begun with a missing couple's failure to return from a camping trip had exposed a criminal enterprise that challenged fundamental assumptions about safety in America's wilderness areas, revealing that even the most remote locations could be exploited by predators who understood how to use isolation and official indifference to hide crimes that continued for years without detection, claiming victims whose disappearances were explained away by the natural hazards that made desert travel dangerous for the unprepared, while the real dangers came from human predators who had learned to hunt in places where screams would never be heard, and evidence could be buried so deep that it might never surface again. The trial of Marcus Webb and his co-conspirators became a media sensation that exposed the horrifying reality of human trafficking operations hidden in America's most remote wilderness areas, with District Attorney Rebecca Hartman presenting evidence that detailed a criminal enterprise so sophisticated and brutal that it challenged public assumptions about what was possible in the 21st century United States. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the physical evidence recovered from the underground complex, the testimonies of surviving victims who had been rescued from other facilities, and the detailed documentation that the trafficking network had maintained to track their inventory of human cargo across multiple processing and distribution centers throughout the western states. Sarah's journal entries, read aloud in court by Detective Santos, provided the most powerful testimony about the couple's final days, her words creating a silence in the courtroom that seemed to press against the walls, as spectators and jury members confronted the reality of what two innocent people had endured during their last hours of life. Her final entry, written in handwriting that shook with fear and exhaustion, described hearing other voices in the underground complex, the sounds of people who had been held captive for weeks or months, their cries echoing through tunnels that had been designed to muffle any sounds that might carry to the surface world, where rescue might still be possible. The defense attorney's attempts to minimize their client's culpability by characterizing the operation as a spontaneous criminal conspiracy rather than a systematic enterprise were undermined by evidence that revealed years of careful planning and coordination, including detailed maps of potential victim locations, surveillance equipment that had been used to monitor camping areas, and transportation networks that could move human cargo across state lines without detection by law enforcement agencies. The sophistication of the operation's infrastructure and the precision of its execution demonstrated a level of organization that required significant financial resources and technical expertise, indicating involvement by individuals who possessed legitimate skills that had been perverted to serve criminal purposes. The testimony of rescued victims provided devastating accounts of the conditions inside the trafficking network's holding facilities, describing months of captivity in underground spaces where natural light never penetrated, and human contact was limited to interactions with guards who treated prisoners as inventory to be managed rather than people deserving of basic human dignity. These survivors described a hierarchy of victims based on their perceived market value, with some individuals being prepared for immediate transportation, while others were held indefinitely as their captors waited for buyers who specialized in particular demographics or characteristics. The revelation that Sarah and Michael's deaths had been the result of medical complications rather than intentional murder provided no comfort to their families, who understood that their loved ones had died because their captors had viewed them as expendable assets whose medical needs were less important than operational security. The evidence showed that the network possessed the resources to provide medical care when it served their financial interests, but had chosen to let Sarah and her unborn child die rather than risk exposure by seeking help that might have saved their lives. The sentencing phase of the trial brought allocutions from family members whose lives had been forever changed by the trafficking network's activities, with Margaret Chen delivering a victim impact statement that described the decade of uncertainty and grief that had preceded the discovery of her daughter's remains. She spoke about the cruel hope that had sustained her through years of wondering whether Sarah might still be alive somewhere, held captive but potentially recoverable. A hope that had been both a source of strength and a form of torture that had prevented her from finding closure or peace. The geographic scope of the investigation continued to expand as additional facilities were discovered throughout the region, revealing that the Utah complex had been just one component of a network that included holding facilities in abandoned buildings, remote ranches, and other mining areas that provided the isolation necessary for long-term captivity of unwilling victims. Each new discovery brought additional evidence of the network's systematic approach to human trafficking, with standardized procedures for victim processing, transportation, and disposal that had been refined through years of practice and coordination between multiple criminal organizations. The environmental impact of the criminal operation added another dimension to the case, as investigators discovered that the modifications made to abandoned mines had created hazardous conditions that threatened groundwater supplies and soil stability throughout the region. The chemicals used to maintain underground facilities and dispose of evidence had contaminated areas that would require extensive remediation, while the structural modifications made to tunnel systems had created collapse risks that posed ongoing dangers to legitimate researchers and recreational cavers who might venture into areas that appeared safe but had been destabilized by criminal activities. The federal charges that emerged from the investigation included not just human trafficking and murder, but also environmental crimes, weapons violations, and racketeering charges that reflected the full scope of a criminal enterprise that had operated across multiple jurisdictions while exploiting regulatory gaps that allowed activities in remote areas to proceed without oversight. The complexity of the case required coordination between federal, state, and local agencies that had never before confronted a criminal organization that used geography and bureaucratic confusion as primary tools for avoiding detection and prosecution. As the legal proceedings continued, additional victims were identified through DNA analysis of remains found in other facilities, bringing the confirmed death toll to more than 30 individuals whose disappearances had been explained away by natural hazards or personal problems that had seemed to provide reasonable explanations for missing person cases that were actually the result of systematic criminal predation. The discovery that so many people had vanished into a network that treated human beings as commercial inventory raised disturbing questions about how many other criminal enterprises might be operating in remote areas where official attention was minimal and public scrutiny was virtually non-existent. The discovery that would bring the Chen case full circle came in the summer of 2020, when amateur explorers David Kim and Jessica Martinez embarked on what they intended as a recreational mapping expedition of abandoned mines near Moab, their GPS units and climbing equipment allowing them to access areas that had been overlooked during the original investigation a decade earlier. Kim, a geology graduate student at the University of Utah, had been researching historical mining operations for his thesis when he discovered discrepancies between official mine surveys and the actual extent of underground workings, gaps in documentation that suggested significant areas had never been properly explored or documented by either mining companies or law enforcement agencies. The mine entrance that Kim and Martinez discovered was concealed behind a rockfall that appeared to have occurred naturally, but showed subtle signs of human intervention when examined closely, with stone placement that seemed designed to hide the opening while maintaining structural integrity that would allow access by individuals who knew exactly where to look. The tunnel beyond the entrance extended much deeper than the explorers had expected, with passages that branched into a complex network of chambers and corridors that had been excavated far beyond what would be necessary for simple ore extraction, suggesting that the underground spaces had been developed for purposes that had nothing to do with historical mining operations. The chamber where Kim and Martinez made their horrifying discovery was located nearly 300 feet underground, accessible only through a series of narrow passages that would have made escape impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the underground layout. The space had been modified with concrete flooring and ventilation systems that indicated recent use, while the presence of modern electrical equipment suggested that someone had invested significant resources in making the underground area suitable for long-term occupation or storage. The air in the chamber carried a chemical odor that was distinctly unpleasant, suggesting activities that involved substances not normally associated with legitimate mining or geological research. The skeletons that the explorers found were positioned side by side in what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement, their remains showing signs of having been undisturbed for years, while being protected from the environmental factors that would normally accelerate decomposition in underground spaces. The larger skeleton was clearly that of an adult male, while the smaller remains beside it showed the distinctive pelvic structure of a pregnant female, with tiny bones in the abdominal area that represented the couple's unborn child who had died with his parents in this remote underground chamber that had become their tomb. Kim's immediate recognition of the significance of their discovery led to careful documentation with digital cameras and GPS coordinates before the explorers contacted authorities, their training in scientific methodology ensuring that the crime scene would be preserved in a condition that would allow proper forensic analysis. The photographs they took showed not just the skeletal remains, but also personal belongings that had survived a decade underground, including items that would prove crucial for identifying the victims and understanding the circumstances that had led to their deaths in this hidden chamber. The forensic examination conducted by the Utah State Medical Examiner confirmed what investigators had suspected since the discovery of the trafficking network's underground facilities, with DNA analysis providing definitive proof that the remains belonged to Sarah and Michael Chen and their unborn son, while the condition of the bones revealed details about their final days that added new dimensions to understanding what the couple had endured during their captivity. The skeletal evidence showed signs of malnutrition and stress that indicated prolonged confinement under harsh conditions, while the positioning of the remains suggested that they had died together in circumstances that had allowed them to maintain physical contact during their final moments. The personal belongings found with the remains included Sarah's wedding ring and the digital memory cards from Michael's camera, items that had been missed during the hasty disposal of evidence that followed their deaths. The memory cards, despite years of exposure to underground moisture, yielded dozens of photographs that provided a haunting record of the couple's final camping trip, images of happiness and anticipation that contrasted sharply with the grim reality of where those photographs had been discovered. The final images on the cards showed their campsite during their last evening alive, the normal activities of a couple enjoying their last adventure before becoming parents, unaware that predators were already moving to destroy their future. The discovery of additional evidence in the chamber revealed that Sarah and Michael had not been the only victims held in this particular underground space, with personal belongings from other individuals suggesting that the chamber had been used as a holding area for multiple kidnapping victims over a period of several years. The systematic arrangement of these items indicated that the chamber had served as both a prison and a disposal site, with victims being held there during transportation delays before being moved to other locations or eliminated when they were no longer useful for trafficking purposes. The location of the chamber, nearly 2 miles from where the Chen's camping equipment had been found, explained why the original search operation had failed to discover their remains, despite extensive efforts to cover the area around their campsite. The underground passage that connected the chamber to other parts of the mine complex would have allowed their captors to transport them far from their abduction site, while remaining completely hidden from surface-based search efforts, demonstrating the sophisticated planning that had characterized the trafficking network's operations throughout its years of activity. As investigators processed the scene where Sarah and Michael Chen had spent their final days, the full scope of their tragedy became clear, revealing that they had survived their initial abduction only to die slowly in underground darkness, their deaths representing not just personal loss, but evidence of a criminal enterprise that had claimed dozens of victims while remaining hidden in the vast emptiness of Utah's desert wilderness, protected by isolation and official assumptions that missing persons in remote areas were probably victims of natural hazards rather than human predators who had learned to hunt in places where rescue was impossible and evidence could remain hidden for decades. The closure that finally came to the Chen family through the discovery of Sarah and Michael's remains was accompanied by the bitter knowledge that their loved ones had suffered far more than anyone had dared to imagine during the decade of uncertainty that followed their disappearance. Margaret Chen, now in her 70s, stood at the graveside where her daughter, son-in-law, and unborn grandson were finally laid to rest together, the headstone bearing dates that marked not just their births and deaths, but the 10-year gap during which their fate had remained unknown. The funeral service was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the couple's story, including members of search and rescue teams who had never stopped wondering whether they had missed something that might have led to a different outcome. The legal aftermath of the discovery continued for years, as additional prosecutions were brought against network members who had been identified through evidence found in the underground chamber, with each new arrest revealing more details about the scope and sophistication of criminal operations that had exploited America's wilderness areas to hide activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about safety and security in remote locations. The trafficking network's use of abandoned mining infrastructure represented a new category of criminal enterprise that required law enforcement agencies to develop specialized expertise in underground search and rescue operations, while also recognizing that traditional approaches to missing person investigations were inadequate for cases involving organized criminal predation. The environmental cleanup required to address the contamination and structural damage caused by the trafficking network's underground modifications became a multi-million-dollar project that involved federal agencies responsible for mine safety and environmental protection. revealing that the criminal enterprise had created hazards that would threaten public safety for generations. The chemicals used to maintain underground facilities and dispose of evidence had created contamination plumes that threatened groundwater supplies throughout the region, while the structural modifications made to tunnel systems had destabilized areas that posed ongoing collapse risks to anyone who might venture into seemingly safe underground spaces. The memorial established at the site where Sarah and Michael's camping equipment had been found became a destination for family members and supporters who wanted to honor the couple's memory while also acknowledging the broader tragedy of human trafficking that their case had exposed. The memorial included information about recognizing signs of criminal activity in remote areas and resources for reporting suspicious behavior to authorities, transforming a site of personal tragedy into an educational resource that might help prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. The academic research generated by the Chen case led to new protocols for wilderness search and rescue operations that recognized the possibility of criminal activity in missing person cases, with training programs that taught search teams to identify signs of human trafficking and to preserve evidence that might be crucial for criminal prosecutions. The case also influenced policy discussions about federal jurisdiction over crimes committed in remote areas, addressing regulatory gaps that had allowed criminal enterprises to operate across state lines while avoiding consistent law enforcement attention. The ongoing mystery that haunted investigators even after the successful prosecutions was the question of how many other victims might remain undiscovered in remote locations throughout the western United States, with estimates suggesting that the trafficking network's full scope might never be completely understood due to the vast areas involved and the sophisticated methods used to conceal evidence. The discovery of each new facility raised the possibility that other underground chambers contained remains that would never be found without systematic exploration efforts that were beyond the resources of most law enforcement agencies. David Kim and Jessica Martinez, the amateur explorers whose discovery had finally provided answers about the Chen family's fate, continued their mapping work with a new understanding of the importance of documenting abandoned mine locations and reporting any signs of recent human activity to appropriate authorities. Their experience had transformed what began as academic research into a form of public service that recognized the potential for hidden dangers in areas that appeared to offer only natural hazards to unwary travelers. The lasting impact of Sarah and Michael Chen's story extended beyond the specific criminal network that had claimed their lives, serving as a reminder that evil could flourish in places where isolation provided cover for activities that civilized society preferred not to acknowledge or confront. Their deaths had exposed a form of criminality that exploited the very wilderness areas that Americans cherished as refuges from urban complexity, revealing that even the most remote landscapes could harbor predators who understood how to use geography and official indifference to hide crimes that violated every principle of human decency. As the sun set over the Utah desert where Sarah and Michael had once planned to watch the stars with their unborn child, the red rock formations that had drawn them to their final adventure continued to guard secrets that might never be fully revealed, standing as silent witnesses to tragedies that occurred in places where screams would never be heard, and justice might arrive too late to save the innocent, but hopefully in time to prevent other families from learning that even in the 21st century, there were still places where people could vanish as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions that would haunt their loved ones until the earth itself finally surrendered the evidence needed to provide answers and, perhaps, a measure of peace.